Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. In this webinar, we'll explore how batch device configuration can be implemented with the BioStar Device SDK. We'll walk through the overall workflow step by step, using authentication mode as our example. Before we begin, let me briefly share where you can access the webinar resources. The recorded session will be available on the Suprema YouTube channel. You can follow the link on this slide or search for Suprema YouTube. We'll also post the materials and a summary of the Q&A on the Suprema technical support site. You can access it using the link shown here or by searching for Suprema webinar on the support site. Here's a quick overview of today's agenda. We'll start with a brief introduction, then go through the preparation steps, including the environment and build setup. After that, we'll look at why batch configuration is needed, and then walk through the overall batch workflow. Next, we'll review the key APIs involved, followed by a demo to show how everything works in practice. Finally, we'll close with a FAQ. Let's begin with a brief introduction. First, let me explain why this webinar matters. As the number of devices grows, managing device configuration becomes increasingly difficult. Manually repeating the same configuration across multiple devices becomes inefficient and difficult to manage. With the BioStar Device SDK, devices can be discovered automatically. Configurations can be defined once and applied consistently across multiple devices, and the results can be verified through response codes. This approach is called batch configuration. In this session, we'll implement the full workflow using authentication mode as our example. Secondly, let me briefly go over the recommended background for this session. A basic understanding of C# will be helpful, since the example code in this webinar is written in C#. It is also helpful to have some prior experience with the BioStar Device SDK, especially through BS Demo. That said, even if you are new to the SDK, you should still be able to follow along. I'll explain each step clearly as we go. This webinar is intended for developers who want to configure device settings across multiple devices using the BioStar Device SDK. Lastly, let's outline what we'll cover today. In this session, we'll build an understanding of the batch configuration workflow using the BioStar Device SDK. First, we'll look at why batch configuration matters. Then, we'll walk through how the batch workflow works and review the SDK APIs used in each step. After that, we'll move on to a demonstration and finish with a short FAQ. For the scenario in this webinar, we'll discover BioStation 3 devices on the network, connect to multiple devices, configure authentication mode, and apply the same settings across all connected devices. Great, we're all set. Let's move on to preparation, setting up the environment, and building the project. Now, before we begin, please note that this seminar is based on the following environment. The examples and demo in this session were prepared and tested under these conditions. The development environment is Visual Studio 2022 with C#. The SDK version used is BioStar Device SDK 2.9.12, and the device used in this session is BioStation 3 with firmware version 1.4.1. If you haven't installed the BioStar Device SDK yet, you can download it from the Suprema Download Center. Before you begin, I recommend reviewing the official documentation, as it covers pre-build configuration, API references, and other essential setup information. It is also helpful to keep the documentation page open during development. Now that we've finished the preparation, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. In this part, I'd like to explain why batch configuration matters and what we'll cover in today's session. Imagine you need to configure authentication settings on multiple devices. In a manual workflow, you first need to identify each device's IP address, connect to each device individually, and repeat the same setup one by one. This creates two major challenges. First, manual IP lookup. You need to find and enter every device's IP address before you can even begin. Second, repeated manual setup and verification. Applying the same settings across multiple devices takes time, and the results also need to be checked one by one. As the number of devices increases, this quickly becomes inefficient and difficult to manage. So, what happens when you need to configure 50 or even 100 devices? This is where batch configuration comes in. We've just looked at the challenges of manual configuration. Before we go further, let's clarify what batch means. In general, batch configuration means performing the same configuration task across multiple devices. Rather than treating each device as a separate task, batch handles multiple devices within one configuration flow. In the BioStar Device SDK, this does not mean there is a separate batch API. Instead, batch is implemented by repeating the same workflow for each device: connect, configure, and apply. Batch configuration helps address these challenges in 3 ways. First, consistency across devices. It keeps device settings consistent across the deployment, reducing configuration drift between devices. Second, configure once for all. You define the configuration once and apply it to all connected devices instead of repeating the same setup for each one. Third, review results efficiently. After the batch run is complete, you can review the overall outcome on a single page rather than checking each device. And if needed, you can retry only the failed devices instead of repeating the entire process. Alright, now let's move on to the batch workflow in the BioStar Device SDK. We'll use the demo code to walk through the key steps and see how the overall configuration flow works. The batch configuration workflow follows 3 steps: search, configure, and apply. First, search. We discover devices on the same subnet and connect to the ones we want to configure. Next, configure. We define the settings once in a data structure. In today's session, we'll use authentication mode as our example. And finally, apply. We push that configuration to all connected devices and verify the results. Here's the key concept. On the left, you can see the single device flow: connect, define config, apply config. This is what you do for just one device. On the right is the batch flow. The steps are the same, but notice the labels. Connect becomes a loop. We connect to each device one by one. Define config stays as once. We create the configuration structure just one time. Apply config becomes a loop. We send that same configuration to every connected device. The key insight is that the configuration is defined once and applied many times. There's no special batch API. Now that we understand the workflow, let's walk through the APIs for each step and see how they're implemented in code using the BioStar Device SDK. In this webinar, to make the API easier to understand, we'll explain API and batch configuration through a sample program. The program is organized around the following flow. As you can see, the 2 core steps are highlighted in purple: search and batch update. Let's begin with search. Instead of manually entering each device's IP address, we use BS2 search devices to send a UDP broadcast and search devices on the same subnet. The next step is batch update. After search, we connect to the target devices, define the configuration once, apply it to each connected device, and then disconnect. For today's session, we'll focus mainly on these 2 parts and skip the initialize and release steps. Here's the code structure overview. The program begins with run and proceeds through 4 main stages. First, it searches for devices available on the same subnet with BS2 search devices. Second, it retrieves the discovered device list by calling BS2 getDevices. Third, it connects to the selected devices using their device IDs through BS2 connect_device. And finally, once the connection is established, it applies the authentication configuration using BS2 set_auth_config ext. Overall, this code is organized as a step-by-step flow: search, retrieve, connect, and apply configuration. First, I'd like to walk you through the device search flow. In this step, the SDK discovers available devices on the same subnet using UDP broadcast, and then we select the target devices for this session. The SDK sends a UDP broadcast to the subnet, which allows us to discover devices even when their IP addresses are not known in advance. As shown in the middle box, the search results may include different Suprema device models, such as BioStation 3, BioStation 2, or BioEntry P2. However, in this session, we use BioStation 3 as our example device. So rather than using every discovered device, we focus only on the BioStation 3 devices from the list. After calling BS2 search devices, we use BS2 getDevices to retrieve the discovered device IDs. Then for each device ID, we call BS2 getDeviceInfo to obtain detailed device information. Based on that information, we select only the BioStation 3 devices and use them as the target devices for the next step. Let's start with BS2 Set Device Searching Timeout. This API controls how long the SDK waits for responses after a device search is started. You pass in a timeout value in seconds, and the default is 5 seconds, which works well in most environments. If the timeout is too short, you might miss some devices. If it is too long, you may end up waiting unnecessarily. Once the timeout value is applied successfully, you're ready to start the search. Next, we call BS2 Search Devices, which is used to discover devices on the same subnet. This API sends out a UDP broadcast on the subnet, and Suprema devices on that subnet respond to it. The SDK stores those responses internally, but this API does not establish a connection. It is purely a discovery step. One important limitation is that, because this is based on UDP broadcast, it only works within the same subnet. If your devices are on a different subnet, this API will not find them. In that case, you would need to use BS2 Connect Device via IP directly with a known device IP. If the search call succeeds, it returns a success code. After that, the actual list of discovered devices can be retrieved separately using BS2 Get Devices. Once the search is complete, the next step is to retrieve the list of discovered devices by calling BS2 Get Devices. This API returns the list of device IDs and the total number of devices found. In other words, these are the devices that responded to the broadcast within the timeout window we set earlier. From there, we go through the device IDs and call BS2 Get Device Info for each one. This gives us device information such as the device type, IP address, and port number. In this program, we are interested only in BioStation 3 devices. So, after retrieving the device information, we check the type field and keep only the devices identified as BioStation 3. At the end of this step, we have a clean list of BioStation 3 devices ready for the next step. Now that we've identified the target devices, the next step is to connect to them using BS2 Connect Device. This API establishes a connection to a specific device using its device ID. Once the connection is established, that device is ready for the next operations, such as applying configuration. In other words, the connected device ID becomes the handle we use in the following steps. In this program, we repeat BS2 Connect Device for each selected device. In today's webinar, we specifically select BioStation 3 devices and connect only to those devices. Now that the selected devices are connected, we can move on to configuring the authentication mode. In this demo, authentication mode is used as the example setting. This setting defines which credentials can be used for authentication on the device. On BioStation 3, the supported credentials include visual face, barcode, user ID, card, QR code, and PIN. Please note that QR code requires a separate license. And because this is a batch configuration workflow, the same setting will be applied to all selected devices. In the next step, we will look at how this authentication mode is represented in the SDK and how it is applied to each connected device. This is the step where the configuration is sent to the device. This is what BS2 Set Auth Config EXT does. As shown in the diagram, this API sends the completed BS2 Auth Config EXT structure to the device and applies the configuration there. In other words, this is the point where the configuration defined in code becomes device behavior. When a user presents a credential such as face, card, or PIN, the device validates it based on the authentication modes and schedule settings we configured earlier. This configuration controls more than just authentication modes. It also includes additional options such as global anti-passback, matching timeouts, and other related settings. One important note: BS2 Set Auth Config EXT is intended for visual face-based devices such as BioStation 3, FaceStation F2, and BioEntry W3. For devices that do not support visual face authentication, you should use the standard BS2 Set Auth Config API instead. Finally, since we are building a batch configuration program, we repeat this process for each connected device. Let us look at how auth mode settings are mapped in the BioStar Device SDK. In this step, we define which authentication modes are allowed, such as face, card, ID, or combinations like face plus PIN. On the left, you can see the authentication mode selected in the program. Each mode maps to a specific index in the ext auth schedule array inside bs2 auth config ext. One important detail is that ext auth schedule is not just an on and off flag. It stores schedule values that determine when each authentication mode is active. If the value is greater than 0, that authentication mode is enabled. If the value is 0, it is disabled. In this demo, we use the value 1, which represents the always schedule. So for every authentication mode we want to enable, we set its corresponding index to 1. Now that we have selected the authentication modes, the next step is to build the bs2 auth config ext structure. In this step, the selected auth mode values are mapped into the configuration structure, together with other required settings such as server matching and timeout values. Once the structure is ready, we use bs2 set auth config ext to apply it. Since this is a batch workflow, we repeat the same call for all connected BioStation 3 devices. In other words, we prepare the configuration once and then send the same structure to multiple devices in a loop. At this point, the same configuration has been applied to all selected devices. Let us now take a look at the result. Here, you can see the console output from running the demo program. This is the final step, where we review the batch configuration results. For each device, the program shows whether the configuration was applied successfully. It also provides a final summary of the overall batch run. Based on this summary, we can quickly confirm the overall outcome and identify any failed devices. Now let's jump into the demo. I'll walk you through the entire workflow, from device discovery and selection to connection and authentication configuration, using the BioStar Device SDK. Let's get started. Let's take a look at some frequently asked questions. The first question is batch configuration limited to auth mode settings? No. Batch configuration is not limited to authentication configuration. It can also be applied to other device settings that are supported by the BioStar Device SDK. However, supported configuration items may differ depending on the device model and its capabilities. So before applying a configuration in batch, you should first confirm through the relevant SDK APIs whether the target device supports that feature. The second question is, what happens if some devices fail during batch configuration? In the BioStar Device SDK, each device is processed individually, and each API call returns its own result code. For each device, the result can be checked through the return code provided by the SDK. What happens next depends on how the program is implemented. For example, in our demo program, even if one device fails, the program continues with the next device. After the batch configuration is complete, it provides a final summary so that failed devices can be identified. The third question is there any limitation on the number of devices? The BioStar Device SDK supports up to 1,024 device connections. However, the actual number of devices that can be handled effectively depends on server performance, network conditions, and the way the program is implemented. The last question is, what are the key differences between BS2 setAuthConfig EXT and BS2 setAuthConfig? BS2 setAuthConfig EXT is used for visual face-based devices such as BioStation 3, FaceStation F2, and BioEntry W3. If the device does not support visual face authentication, you should use BS2 setAuthConfig instead. Another key difference is the structure layout. In BS2 authconfig, the auth schedule array starts at index 0. But in BS2 authconfig EXT, the authentication schedules start at index 11. Because of this, the mapping values inside the auth schedule array are different, so it's important to use the correct structure based on your device model. For more details, please check the link shown here. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I hope this session helped clarify the batch device configuration workflow using the BioStar Device SDK.